Okay, so nice to meet you all this morning. I've seen some faces before, and great to be presenting this topic, which is one which is extremely close to my heart. I've probably been recruiting for 30 years now, which is really scary to say. It makes me feel extremely old, but clearly I started when I was a young child. But anyway, I've got so much content. As always, I want to try and give you as much takeaways as you can. As you can see on the screen there, we are asking you about your confidence with this topic. So if you don't mind just popping your answers in there to begin with, so it gives me a feel for how much knowledge people have about recruitment and onboarding. I'm not going to test anybody, it's just to give me a heads up so I know how to pitch the content. So if you don't mind just doing the Slido there, please, right now. Okay, so there's a mixture of experience and confidence, which is great to see. Just wait a couple more minutes or so. Okay, that's good. So we have a couple of experts, a couple lower down and a good chunk in the middle, which is great to see. So thank you. Okay, so we'll move on now, if that's okay. So, and just one more slide, if you don't mind. And again, sorry. So today I want to talk about these things. Let's look at common pitfalls that you might be experiencing at the moment, or any concerns you may have. Look at some of that content. We'll address that throughout the session today. I want to talk to you about the cost of poor selection, because I'm constantly working with managers who are trying to find people and often say, oh, let's just appoint that person. That poor selection decision can have such significant consequences, not only team-wise, business-wise, but financially. So we'll cover that. Look at the types of selection. Some of you might be using these selection methods already, so let's explore the validity and reliability of those. Look at competencies and values. Talk about a quick way of doing recruitment using a process called STARS. Look at data, look at structure. And the last topic, which is becoming more and more common in today's world, is the issue of neurodiversity and unconscious bias, and being aware of that when you're recruiting. Lots to cover, not much time, so I am going to race through. Do ask questions as we go, but hopefully we'll be able to cover everything today. So, common pitfalls. I hear this constantly when I'm working with managers about how to recruit and things that they're finding tough. The first thing I see is I ask people, how many interviewers are you using? And often it's just one interviewer. That's the first thing to change. I know if you're a very small business, there might only be one person involved, but where possible, have two opinions, because you've all got your own unconscious bias that you may or may not be aware about. And by involving another party, you're going to bring a more objective decision. Equally, don't just rely on one process. Try and include multiple methods, whether it be a telephone interview, whether it be a second opinion, whether it be a work test, a free trial. There are so many ways you can try before you buy. So take the time to make those decisions. So that's a common pitfall I'm currently seeing frequently. Selection bias. Somebody looks like me, so clearly they must be great. Happens all the time. And it's about being aware of those biases and trying to use other methods to overcome those biases. This is the one I'm seeing at the most. There is no one else. What do I do? How do I recruit somebody when they're the best of a bad bunch? Let's just take them on. Yes, you could do, but again, there are other ways. You can take on some temporary staff, you can multi-skill, you can coach individually in your current workforce, you can do some development planning. There are many ways that you should be looking rather than taking on that potentially average employee. Equally, if you take them on, make sure you've got good contracts with probation periods, so if they don't perform, you are able to get rid of them before they kick into becoming a full-time permanent employee. Didn't take any notes. Oh my goodness, this happens so common. Or I write a few points on the back of a piece of paper and put it somewhere. Legally, a candidate can take you to a tribunal for unfair treatment through the selection process. You can be taken under the Defamation Act. You can be taken for so many ways, and I've seen it happen. There are people out there that do this as a profession, sending in 2 CVs with exactly the same content and different names doctored on the CV, and then take people to tribunals and so on because of discrimination claims and so on. If you don't have notes to back up your process, how will you defend yourself? So it's really important that you are taking valid notes that are objective and decipherable at a later date. So yeah, one quick tip to implement there. Cultural fit. This is more common more recently. Yes, you can assess whether the individual is perfect in terms of the skill level required, but what about fitting into your culture? Again, I get managers to ask questions around this now. What makes you motivated? When were you most satisfied at work? Those kind of questions, which give you a feel for whether the individual will fit into your culture, which is a very important part of the recruitment process. And like I'm doing today, the interviewer talked far too much. You really want the candidate to be speaking for 80% of the time, and you as the interviewer listening, learning, observing, taking notes. That's what you should be doing in the interview process. Okay, let's move on, because like I said, we're racing through today. Concerns, cover this quickly. They just weren't quite right. How do you further assess that? They wouldn't fit into my team. Not sure they're going to fit into my team. Again, let's go back to try before you buy. Let's go back to workplace tests. Let's go back to cultural questions. My head says yes, but my heart says no. Tough one. Again, I go back to do another selection method, use another way to check whether they might fit into your team, bring them in, get them to meet the team, etc. There's a cultural mismatch. So questions on culture are key, because even if you've got somebody that is performing great, yet they just don't fit with the team, then that's a problem. The team don't accept them. The team feel they have to carry them. You've got to ask questions around culture. Technically, they're brilliant, but there's something I'm not sure about. Again, they're not quite right. Do multiple selection methods. Don't feel you have to make a decision based on one interaction. Take the time to do additional testing, interviewing, etc. I'm not sure they would want to work here. So what I suggest is you give the candidate as much information about your place of work, because what you don't want to happen is they turn up on day one and go, hang on, this was oversold to me, or this isn't what you told me. So don't try and kid them. Present your culture, present your workplace as it is. You don't want any surprises, because what you don't want is to invest in all the time and money in this recruitment, and 2 months down the line, they resign because it's just not what you explained. So be completely transparent. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So I'm going to come to a question now. And for those of you who've been to these workshops before, you might know the answer, so you've got a heads up. How much do you think it costs for a poor hire of a first line manager? So somebody who is now managing a team, so you can estimate what that salary might be. But what do you think it would cost if you recruited the wrong person, and you then either had to manage them out, they left, the team got upset, etc.? What do you think it would cost? So let's have a look. Okay. So there's a few people going less, majority going more than 100K. Couple more seconds. Okay. So at 42% think it's over 100K, 28% think it's 75K, 24% 50K, and 8% 25K. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this is telling me, this is data which comes from the Institute of Recruitment Professionals. Slightly old now, so this is actually probably a little bit less than what it would be, but this is telling us, which is quite scary, that £132,000 or thereabouts on a poor hire at first line manager level. So think about somebody you might be recruiting now or recently or shortly, and think about the time that you're going to spend in doing that. First of all, you've got a gap in your organization. You've got somebody maybe who's carrying the team. You've got to try and find someone to fill that gap. You've obviously got issues. You've got time to recruit. You've got recruitment fees. You've got the team currently holding that gap. You've got training on the individual once they begin. You've got loss of productivity from the rest of the team. You might even have, particularly for a management level, if the manager who has joined isn't particularly strong or an effective manager, they might create a few ripples amongst the team, which may result in other people leaving if they don't like their particular leadership style. You've got the salary you're paying this individual for the time that they're there. You've got all sorts of factors going on here. So you can see that by making that decision, when you're considering who you're going to hire and you're thinking, oh, they're just not quite right, oh, best of a bad bunch, or those concerns we talked about earlier, if you make the wrong decision here, you potentially are creating a significant financial loss for the business. So with all HR processes, and I work across the HR spectrum, dealing with everything from onboarding to performance management, to training and development, to termination of contract, I always say, this is the point, you've got to get it right, because if you're bringing somebody in that's not quite right, that creates ripples amongst the team, I'm pretty certain that down the line, if this person doesn't resign, you are then going to be involved in discussions around poor performance, trying to get this manager to improve. You'll potentially discussing termination of contract. Most of the problems you experience down the employment line can usually be traced back, not always, but can usually be traced back to a poor hire or to some nervousness at recruitment or gut feel that they weren't quite right. So if you can eradicate that at this stage and save yourself a lot of money, why don't you do that? So this conversation today is one of the most important conversations you're having about getting employment right, because it can really save you some time and money down the line. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So I've covered this already. We talk about low morale on the team, salary, training. Didn't talk about the impact on the customer though, because if you've got somebody employed and that has a knock-on effect to bad customer service, that can equally affect your brand, affect your customer loyalty. So there's other costs there that are also important to consider. Training, turnover, lost productivity. Again, you're going to have less output with the newer manager, perhaps. Discrimination claims, the one at the bottom, we haven't even begun to discuss that, but that's a valid concern and a costly concern, depending on whether you are getting, what your behaviour is like at recruitment. You just go to look at case law about some of the conversations at tribunal around discrimination for candidates during the recruitment process. And it's really scary, an uncapped amount of damages awarded for discrimination. So again, for that reason in itself, it's really important that you're doing this properly. Okay, moving along, please. So selection, reliability, and validity. You may have heard of this before, but reliability is whether a selection method is consistent for all candidates. So you might recruit or interview 4 candidates in a day. If you're finding that you're adapting the interview or changing questions, or not using the same set of questions, you're just feeling it on the day, having a bit of a coffee chat, then that lowers the reliability of that selection method. And again, that could come under scrutiny. So it's important that you're asking candidates the same type of questions. I'm not saying you can't adapt them for people with disabilities or neurodiverse conditions. Of course you can. But in essence, you've got to be asking the same types of question or content of question to check that that individual compares with the next individual. Validity is whether a selection method actually tells us what we need to know. So am I going to ask a question that is going to give me information about how this person will perform? And the closer you can get to doing that, the higher the validity. So these selection methods that you can see on this screen here, there's a variety that I've used in passing, and I'm sure some of you have used as well. But the research tells us that they're not all as high as they could be in terms of reliability and validity. So effectively, by using one of those methods, are they going to give you an accurate assessment about whether this individual can work and do the job? That is, in essence, what we're asking. So I want to know what your thoughts are here about each of these, and I'll just go through with you what they all mean. You may have seen these, used them already. So reference checks. I think most people these days are quite nervous about reference checks. There is no legal or legislation around how you should conduct a reference check. You're only really covered by data protection. And in some instances, if it gets to this point, you're also covered by the Defamation Acts 2013. So reference checks are an interesting one because depending on who is doing the reference, and all sorts of environmental factors, where they worked before, whether they were in a good employment relationship, whether they were managed by somebody effective or not, reference checks can be good, can be not so good. So that they are one selection method that people do rely on. Reasoning tests or psychometrics, getting somebody to do a verbal reasoning to assess their maths probability, getting them to do psychometrics to assess the type of team player they are. Equally, you may have used some of those methods as well. Work sample tests, they are getting a candidate to actually do the job or an element of the work. So you might get them, if the job is quite a finance number-based role, you might get them to do some maths or some problem solving to see how they would perform in making those kind of mathematical assessments on the job. Assessment centres usually assess a number of different factors. They have an interview, they'll have a team exercise, they'll possibly have a role play, they might have some psychometrics. So they consist of a lot of different assessment methods, hard to set up and manage, and usually for high volume recruitment. So if you're just doing a one-off or a couple of roles, you possibly don't have enough people to put through. They can be quite costly as well. Trial periods, this is what I'm seeing more and more people doing. If you want to come and work here, we'd like to see you first, paid or unpaid, depending on what the situation is. But getting the person to feel the job, experience job shadowing prior to working. And it gives both candidate and employer a good feel for what they're going to be doing. So that I'm seeing those happening more and more today. Unstructured interviews, this is by far the one that I see the most of. Come in and have a chat, come and have a coffee. We'll assess the cultural fit, which is great. But there's not a lot of structure, and I don't really see a lot of note-taking or any paper trail of what's being discussed. And then competency values-based interviews, where you're actually scrutinizing particular competencies that are relevant for the job. So it might be customer service, it might be problem solving, and you're asking questions around those particular areas. Equally, you might have a set of values that you're using as a business, and you are saying that everything you're doing involves those values. Again, it could be integrity, it could be transparency, it could be client-focused. And then people are asking questions around those values to see how much or how high an individual places value on that particular area. So I'm seeing that happening more. So my question to you now is, which one is best? If we go to the next slide, please. You can see I have a Slido here to talk about each of those areas. And I want you to take a guess at which you think is the most reliable and valid. And I've given you a bit of a hint with my introduction to those. So have a selection on one of those methods as you think is the most reliable and valid. Okay. Nobody want to go for the coffee chat? It has its time and place. Okay, I think we're almost there. Any last comments or poll? Okay, I think we're there. So let's have a look. So we have got, coming in at the top is the competency or value-based interview at 62%. Which is positive, which is good to see that people are rating that as the highest method in terms of reliability and validity. My question to you is, how many of you are actually using those methods? But that's a rhetorical question. Have a think about that. Trial periods, yes, definitely. Trial periods are good, very, very reliable. So that's good to see. Some people have chosen that. And then we go to work sample test, again, another effective way. No one's selected reference checks or tests, interestingly. I do see some people swear by using testing and assessment centres. Not so common these days, just because of volume, I think, but although interesting that no one's commented on that. So if we go to my next slide, I think I did have the answers on the next slide. Yes. So we have the most effective method is actually the work sample tests at 0.54. So that is a good indicator. It's a good way to max or to mirror the closeness of what the person will be doing on the job and testing their performance in that. And also it's a reliable test in that if you're using it for the same candidates, it should give you the same results. So a good one to do. So if you're not currently using tests, it's not difficult. You can, there are online providers for that, but you can create your own in terms of replicating a type of process or capability that you're requiring for your work. So I've got a client that is a flooring company, and they have a set of tests which, sort of work questions, work scenarios based on what that particular role is. And they've just created that and used it as part of their Indeed process. So it's not difficult to do. The next one down is the competency values-based interviews, which I will talk about in more detail today, because that is a very strong way to identify the best candidates for your positions. So that's not surprising. And then the one below that is the trial period. Again, a nice method to be able to get people in, try before you buy, open transparency for both parties. So whether you pay, whether you unpay, whether you contract, whether you do a standard sort of confidentiality agreement, those sorts of things to think about. If you've got someone coming into your business and they're observing methods and processes, you do need to protect yourself in that area. We support candidates in doing that type of activity, but it is something you might want to think about. Go down next to assessment centres, which again I highly reliable. It's just that they are quite time consuming, costly to set up, and as I said earlier, you are looking at the actual high volumes of recruitment. And then we go to coffee chat, which, as I said earlier, alluded to, it's a fairly inaccurate process. It can be good. I'm not saying you shouldn't be using it, but that might be tagged onto the end of some of these previous methods. And also, as I said earlier, reference checks, psychometrics can be good, can give you additional information, but I wouldn't just be relying on them in terms of the overall tool you're going to be using. This number is the percentage accuracy. So we're talking about 100%. This is, if you're the higher the percentage, obviously, the more accurate the selection method will be. So think about your own process. Think about what you're doing across that whole piece. As I said earlier, it's not about just one method. It's about multiple methods, taking the time to ensure you're finding that right person. And it might be that you do a competency-based interview to begin with. You're not feeling 100% that you're comfortable this person's going to fit or going to be the right cultural fit, have the right skill. You might then bring them back in to do a sample test or send them a sample test of work, a case study type questionnaire perhaps. Together with that, you might get them to come in the following week to meet the team, have a look at the type of work that could be on, they could be doing, delivering, and carry it on like that. You then would back that up with potentially a reference check, and so on. So it's about bringing in the right selection for what works for you, bearing in mind that if you're doing multiple methods for one candidate, you should be doing multiple methods for the second candidate, because the process has to be consistent. Because if you were to just do a competency-based interview for candidate A and then candidate B, you did 5 further methods of selection, that is an unfair selection process because it's not being administered in the same way. So do just be mindful about being consistent with each candidate. Okay, let's move on now to the next slide, which is growing more and more common with today's recruitment, particularly because a lot of people are working from home and it's hard to assess from the outset, from just doing sort of selection methods, whether this person will fit. And equally, you're working in a different way, you're working remotely, you want to understand more about how that person ticks and what motivates them, because particularly if they are in isolation or a couple of days a week working at home, you want to understand what's important to them, where they may be demotivated, where they feel that they need to have some encouragement, etc. So culture and values are very important. Values are an easy one because most companies these days aspire to a set of values, whether it be their business objectives, whether it be their own sort of customer values that they're working to, showcasing to customers. So most companies have a set of values that they operate against. If you don't, it's not a problem. Then if the next phase, I would say, is work around what's important to you as a business. What kind of culture, if you were to try and assess your culture, what kind of culture do you have? How would you describe your culture? Fast-paced, calm, environmentally friendly, dynamic, innovative. Think about those sorts of ways, and they're the sorts of questions or areas you would then be wanting to ask in your interview process. Because it's all good and well to have a particular job title, such as designer, but then if it doesn't match the type of culture that you're working with, I've got a lot of clients now that are remote and their culture has shifted from where they were 3 years ago to how they work now. So it's important that you factor that into your interview process. I'd ask clients, how would you describe our culture? What kind of employer would you say we are? And then you want to ask your candidates those kinds of questions, because if you're struggling with finding candidates, you go back to the crux of it. What is your culture? And as you can see from that slide, that quote there from Roy Disney, it's not hard to make decisions once you know what your values are. Go back to basics. Think about what's important to you as a business, and then think you need to find that particular skill or that particular value in your candidates. And if they don't have it, it's a no-brainer. We don't want to employ them. Maybe you take that stance. So think about that as part of your selection process, and then try and include those values in your selection methods. If we move on to the next slide, please. So when you're questioning around values and competencies, you really want to be looking at questions that bring those values to life. And I could spend hours on how to ask good questions, but in essence, you're looking at open questions. So the questions which begin with what, how, when, where, etc., rather than leading questions such as did you, or have you, or those sorts of obviously leading questions. So if I'm going to ask a question about the competence of problem solving, let's use that as an example. If I say, if I'm talking to them about a particular problem that they've been working on, so I ask them, maybe I ask them a very good open question and say, what problem have you had recently that has caused you some grief? Tell me about that problem. That's an open question. So that's a lovely question. But then I follow that up with, so they might say, I was working on a mathematical equation and I had to think about A, B, and C. And I would then lead with a leading question, which is not what you should do, and say, did it work out? And they all say, yeah, it worked out. Of course it did. Instead, if I say, what happened? They will go, oh, it was a really complex problem. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the solution. Okay, so you've got a bit more data. So again, open questions will elicit more content received by that candidate, or they will give you more information when they respond. Closed questions will usually give you a 1, 2, 3 word answer. Did you like that? Yes, I did. Okay, leading question. What happened? How did you feel about that? Open questions will give you more information. So it's really, really key to structure your questions before you go in there and make sure you're asking those lovely open questions, and even come up with a few follow-up questions that you will also ask in an open way. So that's my first point. Open questions must be asked. I see interviewers frequently interviewing. I coach people on interviewing techniques, and the first question is lovely. It's a lovely open question because it's the one in the sheet that they've written down, all ready to go. They ask the person during the interview and they come back with all this wonderful information, and then they stop it by asking a closed question, and then the whole conversation just stops. Whereas if they turn that question around and ask the second question in an open way, the conversation would have continued to flow. And it's, again, what did you learn from that? What went well? What would you do differently? How did you feel about that? What did everybody else think? Those sorts of questions are the questions you should be following up that first question with, and you'll get much more of an enriched answer, which will give you a good feel about whether this individual can do the job. Equally, open questions will usually tell you whether someone is fabricating a response, because it's harder to lie when you're going into a lot of information, whereas it's quite easy to lie when you say, yes, I did, in response to a closed question. So try practicing those open questions as much as you can. The other concept here on competency-based interviewing is that past behavior does predict future behavior. So rather than saying, what would you do? You're asking somebody, what did you do? You're talking about past tense. And you can see by the example there in innovation, tell me about an idea that had improved the working practices. That's the question. What did you do? What went well? Da, 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 da. Whereas if you say, how innovative are you? Well, that's an open question. But if you say, what would you do in a situation if you needed to come up with something new? They're probably going to come up with a textbook answer because they know what you want to hear. And it's harder to see whether somebody would actually in real life do that. Whereas if you ask them what they did, They're telling you what they did. They're giving you an example of how they've worked, and that's what you want to see. So you look at the example of teamwork. Give me an example of a conflict you have experienced while working in a team. What happened? They're talking about an actual example, as opposed to how would you handle conflict? Oh, well, if it was conflict in the team, of course I would speak to everybody and try and balance the situation. They're going to come up with what you want to hear. So go back to what they did, and that is more likely to give you an accurate assessment of what they will do. Past behavior predicts future behavior. And this concept is categorized as stars. And if we go to the next slide, some of you may have seen this before, but interviewing with a star is about asking for these 4 areas. You want to look at the situation. So let's go to tell me about a time when you had a conflict in a team. The first thing you want to gather is the situation. Okay, so what happened? What was the background? It gives you the context of what the individual is going to tell you about. So they might say, I was working for my employer in a warehouse, and there was an individual that was extremely rude and didn't pull their weight and would be late and moaned all the time. There we go. That's the situation. That's exactly what you want, rather than, oh, I always work in a team. I'm such a team player because I really think it's important about helping individuals. There's no substance there. You want to go back to, okay, tell me when you've done that. What was a situation where you had a problem team member? Okay, go back to the example. Once you've gathered the situation, you then want to understand what the task was at hand. So what was the challenge? What had to be done? So in the team example I've just given you, so what had to be done was the individual needed to be spoken to because they were causing major problems across the rest of the team. And that's what needed to be done. Okay, so now you understand the situation. You understand the task at hand that needed to be addressed. Your next question, lovely open question, is, okay, what did you do? So you can see here, elaborate the action. What did you do? How? What did you use? Etc. So my experience in asking questions is the shorter the question will give you a more detailed response. So I would just simply say, what did you do? Rather than, what did you do? What did you use? How did you use it? When did you? Because the minute you start asking lots and lots of questions, that poor candidate is going to be completely overwhelmed. One simple question, what did you do? Let the candidate speak. And they will probably tell you about the tools they use. They will probably tell you when they approach the individual, how many times they asked them. And if they don't tell you that information, you follow it up with an open question. What else did you do? Who else did you speak to? Who did you involve? Those sorts of additional open questions to get more information. So you now got half a star, you've got a situation, you've got a task, you've got their action. You now need to see, was this effective? You want to see the result. So what was the outcome? Is a lovely question to gather that. And the individual will say, yes, I managed to speak to the team member, and they got a little bit annoyed, but understood where I was coming from. And as a result, the team began to work more effectively. And there's your star. So with every question, whether it be, tell me about a time when you've worked innovatively, or tell me about a time when you've had a complex problem, where you've worked with a team member, you want to be asking stars or gathering stars for each of those questions. And then objectively, you can assess, can this individual do this effectively? So if you're asking about problem solving or teamwork or decision making or customer service, you're asking a star, you're gathering that information, and you're then making an assessment. Is that good? Do I want that to happen in my organization? If they were to do that in my business, would that be effective? And if the answer is yes, then that's good objective data that you've gathered. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So this is something that I see a lot of, again, false stars. So when you're asking these open questions and people start responding with, well, generally, I like to do this, or I often do this. When they start to generalize or be vague, it's not objective data that you're gathering. It's just a false start. It's how they would like to tell you they behave. So all I would say there is, okay, great, thank you. Can you give me a specific example of when you've done that? And get them to give you that star. Because I'm sure if someone were to say to you, as a manager, how do you get the best out of your employees? You're going to say, well, yeah, I'm a great manager. I'm always there for them. I'm always ready to have a meeting when they want to. I run a regular drumbeat meeting. Okay, can you tell me a time when you've done that? Because we all know what everybody should be doing, but what did you actually do? Past behavior will predict future behavior. Go back to that concept. So if you're hearing generally, I think, I feel that this works well, it's not substance. It's not content that you're really assessing. It's just their general feel. It's their opinion. And if they start talking future oriented, I would always do this, I would always do that. Okay, great. Tell me about a time when you did that. Go back to past behavior will predict future behavior. I've just noticed a question, so I'm just going to pick up on that. In being consistent, are we okay to reject a candidate during the process rather than waste their and our time because they just don't come up to what we want in that area? Are we okay to reject a candidate during the process? All I would say on that one is if you're rejecting midway and they haven't had the opportunity to present themselves, particularly with candidates that might have issues around disability or neurodiversity and may struggle partway through the process, you want to be sure you're giving everybody a fair go at the selection process. I'm not sure if that's answered your question. I would always take the time to ponder and review the information that you're gathering through interview, an application, and just take that time before you are quick to reject. But you can reject as long as you have objective data to reject against and you've given everybody the same time. Sorry, I've just seen that question. I just thought I'd answer it as we were here. Okay, let's just move on now to interview structure. I'm sorry if I'm telling you to suck eggs here, but again, it's just important to revisit this. Before the interview, prepare. I can't stress enough. I used to interview large corporates, and I'd meet with the manager or try and meet with the manager prior to the interview. And more often than not, it'd be a quick 5-minute, right, where's the CV? What's the name? And let's go. Who's asking the questions? And there was such poor preparation. That's not a great way to conduct an interview. You really want to be giving your time to look at the CV, firstly against the job advertisement or the job spec or job description, and seeing where the gaps are. Already doing a scrutiny on, okay, so they don't have the elements of innovation that we want that I can see in their CV. We need to really focus on that when we ask the questions on innovation. Or they might have a big gap that they've not worked somewhere for 2 years. We must question that. Again, good open questions, rather than leading them and saying, oh, what did you do then? And were you just busy? You know, what did you do in the 2 year that you weren't working on your CV? Simple question. But prepare your questions so that you are ready in the best way for when you do that interview. And together with the other interviewers, sit down and work out who is going to ask the questions. You have a set of consistent questions for all candidates. How are you going to split those questions? Who is going to take notes? I always encourage both interviewers to take notes, because if one person's notes are very difficult to decipher, you've then got the backup of the other person. But do all that before the interview and spend a good half an hour going through that information so that you are ready and you know exactly where you want to question this candidate further. During the interview, obviously, first impressions count. You look at the Lord Sugar interviews and on The Apprentice, and it makes me cringe because their aim is to make the candidate feel as uncomfortable as possible. But in today's day and age, you're not going to get a good outcome potentially of or a true representation of that individual if you're really making them suffer at interview. Interview should be a nice experience. And these days it is a candidate world. They have the run of the mill. They have got more many positions that they are applying for, and they can really call the shots. So you do want to give a good introduction and a true representation of your business. So explain the purpose and the plan. So if you're going to show that you have structure in an interview, a candidate will be more impressed by your explaining the structure, you're explaining who's taking which role, you're giving them the time, you're really showing that you are a well-oiled machine in terms of a business. That's going to impress the candidate more so than putting them under the spotlight and making them feel uncomfortable. Note-taking, I always say I will be taking notes throughout this interview so that I do not forget any of the information you tell me, and that everything you will tell me will remain confidential. So it's important that you stress that. So again, there is an air of professionalism. You are looking good as a business with how you're treating that individual's data. Someone's just asked a question: is it okay to video or audio record the interviews? You need to seek permission because it is their data, and some people may have a problem with that. So I would always ask that first and explain the reasons why you want to interview. I personally don't, because my note taking is sufficient to cover everything. Equally, if you were ever to be taken to a tribunal, you have video evidence of exactly everything that was said. So as long as you're comfortable that you would not say anything that goes against anything at a tribunal, so you do not say anything which is inappropriate, then that's fine if it is interviewed. It can be good to rely on that interview footage to make those selection decisions. But in my opinion, if you're using good note-taking, you shouldn't need the video evidence, but it's totally up to you. Okay, so let's move on to data, which is kind of linked to what we've just discussed. If you move on to the next slide. With your note-taking, you should be making sure that your data collection is able to be used at a later date, because there are so many lawsuits around recruitment and things were done inappropriately. So it's important that you've got this data and you can rely on it at a later date. So the first thing I would say is how you summarize your data. I personally use sort of shortened verbs or nouns. So if somebody says to me, oh, I'm very, very organized at seminars and I like to take the lead, I would just write organized seminars or something like that. I would just shorten down my nouns and my verbs so that I can remind myself later what they said, but I'm not going into sentence structure. So it's impossible if you're trying to capture everything in a full sentence. And shorthand I also use, so I have my own way of writing various things. I've interviewed a lot, so I know my own shorthand, so I have little codes. Remember shorthand in the back in the day when people actually did do proper shorthand? But all I'll say on the shorthand is, if you are using shorthand that nobody else would ever be able to determine what that means, you must, after the interview, rewrite that word. So I have little codes for with, and I have little codes, I'll use a more than sign if they say, oh, it was a bit more than that, so I'll use a more than sign, or I'll use equal signs and those sorts of things. But after the interview, I will always go back and write it up in longhand, because you know what it's like. If you're interviewing even 4 people in a day, by the time you've got to the 4th person, the first interview will be completely gone, and well, certainly in my memory, it'll be completely gone, and I can only really rely on that data to remind myself. So it's really important that you do write up any shorthand. We talked about stars earlier, and I think it's really, really important that you're categorizing them. I personally do this as I go because I've done it a lot, but I realize if you're trying to work out what's the situation, what's the task, what's the action, what's the result, it might be hard. But I simply just write the sort of the shortened words of whatever the situation was, organized seminars, and in a little circle I'll put an S. So I know I've captured the S. I'll then say had to schedule delegates, had to do get the training notes. Okay, that's the task. I'll put a little T. Then my action was I contacted 50 delegates, organized the training providers, blah, blah, blah. I'll then put a little A with a circle around it. Result was seminar went really well, on time, great feedback, etc. I put a little R with a circle around it. So as I'm going through the interview, I know if I've gathered enough of what I'm looking for. So I will categorize personally as I go. I appreciate for many people that might be a bit too much to do in one sort of multitasking exercise. Certainly, if you don't do it as you go, before you finish the interview, I would say you check that you've gathered all that information. So I just read back over your notes. I'd say to the candidate, could you give me 5 minutes just while I recap and make sure I've got everything I need? I'd then look back and make sure if I've got all my stars. That's how I keep the data collection personally. Also, I would suggest you record any observable behavior. So things like if they fidgeted a lot, again, you can't not recruit somebody because they fidget, but it might be something that is important for the job or not important for the job. So if they're going to be, they're doing certain things throughout the interview and you think it is relevant, then you might want to comment. So if they do get particularly aggressive or they find that it's, I don't want to answer that question, it's not relevant to me, I would make a note of that because that sends an alarm bell in my head. Obviously, anything you're recording can be used at a later date, so you must remember that. Don't write any derogatory terms or anything like that. But you might need to remind yourself that that person got aggressive once you ask them a question on teamwork, for instance. It could be something you check at a second selection method. Again, look at the tense, because if they start talking future tense, they're probably not telling you anything that they've done. They're just talking about textbook. So again, you go back to, okay, tell me a time when that happened. Alrighty, moving on quickly, because I'm conscious that I'm got a lot to cover. We're through most of it now. Data evaluation. There are many ways you can record the data, but to make this selection method more reliable, then you want to use a method of scoring if you can, because you can then compare candidates more easily. So if you've got your competencies that you're using or your values that you're recruiting against, I'd be then using a rating scale. And a simple one, as I've just explained here, is 1, 2, and 3. 2 is what is acceptable. 2 is what you're looking for. If you were to recruit somebody, you'd want them to be a 2. Anything above that, someone really goes out of their way to behave in that particular instance, it's going to be above standard, being a 3. And if they haven't quite done everything you want them to do, it'll be below standard, which is a 1. Very simple. I've seen very complex rating scales over my time, but effectively you want to just be able to compare with other candidates. So let's go back to the example of when you were dealing with a team member who was a problem. So the acceptable answer would be they approached the team member, they politely raised the issue and discussed it with them and listened to their feedback, heard what they had to say, gave some additional feedback, compromised, agreed solution, and everyone's happy. That's about an acceptable answer. If they did that, but then also maybe conducted a team meeting with everybody and got everyone's feedback, did a little bit more than what you would expect, you would rate them a 3. If they didn't do that, but maybe sent them an email and told them they were painful and that people wanted them to change, that would be below standard because that's not nice. That will be a 1, just as a very rough guide. If you had a problem-solving example and you wanted someone to score a 2, you'd be expecting them to consider the options, to review the problem, maybe test a few examples on the problem, evaluate how effective that solution was, maybe rejig it and come up with a final solution. That would be an acceptable answer for problem solving. Above standard might be they do all that, but they involve other people. They go back to the compliance sheet, check against standards. They might test it for longer. They might get involved other players, get some stakeholders involved. That would be above standard problem solving answer. Below standard problem solving might be they considered one way, tried it, it didn't work, and then they gave up. I'm sure they wouldn't tell you that, but thereabouts. So use the scale so that when you've finished your 4 interviews for the day and you've gathered your data, you now can look back at candidate 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you can decide, well, actually, candidate 1, their problem solving was a 3, as was their teamwork, but their customer service was only a 2, was a 2, compared to candidate number 2, who only scored a 1 in problem solving, but scored a 3 in customer service. And then you compare what's the most important for the job, and you decide which is the most suitable candidate, because you're dealing with raw data. Okay, you might have times when your person is unable to answer the question because they don't have that experience. They might be just coming out of uni. They might have had a career break. So you need to take that into account, because obviously you can't just penalize them because they don't have that. But equally, they might take longer to train onto the job. So you have to think about that. But all I do there is I just put a big W with a circle around it, just so I know it's weak. They haven't got that experience. So I can't penalize them, but I just need to be mindful of that. I personally rate each competency. So I will rate them for customer service. I'll rate them for teamwork. I'll rate them for innovation. And then at the end, I'll see. Ideally, I want them all to be a 2 across all of those competencies, because that's standard. If they score a bit more, that's great. If they score a bit less, I wouldn't take them. Unless there was something perhaps that they're inexperienced and they can be developed. And the most important thing is you have your own rating assessment. So you do that yourself after the interview. Your co-interviewer will also individually assess them, and you will then discuss and come up with a consensus. So you shouldn't be just saying, well, what do you think? Should we rate them a 2? Yeah. You should be doing your assessment. They will do theirs. And then you compare and agree to change if necessary. After all that, you then make the selection decision. So there's lots to consider. If you have to do a second selection exercise because you're not quite convinced, perhaps you might do a follow-up phone interview. You might feel that their innovation wasn't strong enough for your business requirement. So I would then say, thanks for your time at interview. There's another sort of step in this process. We're going to follow up with a telephone interview, and you might just follow up on some of the areas that you're unsure of. So let's move on there. Okay. Let's just go to the next slide, which is just changing the sort of content slightly, which is really important to talk about. Unconscious bias. There are so many unconscious bias around, but what we have to be aware of is that it can be unfair, because if you're using unconscious bias without realizing, you may be making inaccurate selection decisions. But effectively, it's a stereotype that you might have, that society might have, based on a characteristic. So you might have someone come into the door who has a walking stick and grey hair, and you might automatically, somewhere deep in your psyche, think this person's too old for the job. But actually, that might have nothing to do with the job, but automatically you get an opinion based on your own beliefs and experience, which you cannot change, about this person. But what's important is to recognize if you're feeling those unconscious biases, and again, try and work out how you can overcome feeling those common biases. Now, there are typical biases that you see in society, and it's all been enhanced through the media, the press, advertising. They enhance these biases. So you might think a woman is going to be a better midwife, for instance, which is a gender bias. You might think an older person has more experience than a younger person. It's factual, they probably do. Doesn't make them better to do the job. So that's another bias. You might think that somebody who has tattoos is going to be really bad at the job because clearly they have low morals if they've got a tattoo. I'm joking, I have a tattoo, so I'm not suggesting that at all. Or equally, you might look at somebody and think, wow, gosh, they look just like me when I began my career. Oh, they must be a good person. Yeah. So there are all these sorts of feelings that go around in your head. You may not be aware of it. You may be aware of it. The more sort of emotionally intelligent you are, you will be aware of it. But the important thing is, well, what do you do about it? So if we go on to the next slide. please. So how do you reduce it? So if you're in a day-to-day environment at work, you should be challenging stereotypes. So when somebody says, you know, people with tattoos really are just the lowest form of society, you should be asking those questions in the workplace. Hang on, what? Why do you believe that? And challenge some of these stereotypes. Challenge why, you know, certain genders can't do jobs, why certain ages can't do jobs. Just have those conversations in the workplace, because it makes you start to become aware of it as individuals. And then if you happen to be recruiting, you've already had these conversations with your colleagues. You're having these conversations with your co-interviewers. You know, why do you believe that way? What is substantiated about somebody with a tattoo being worse at work? There is no evidence around that. Anonymized CVs. So sometimes I suggest, and a lot of recruitment companies do this, take away date of birth, take away geography, location, and even change names, which I know is another conversation for another day, but try to remove the fact that maybe the person you're interviewing has a certain name, which maybe make you think that they're a certain religion or a certain race, which may make you think that they must behave in a certain way, because again, you automatically go to certain places. It's promoted in society and it's reinforced through advertising. It's around us every day, but it's about being aware of it. If you do what I have told you in terms of use these selection methods, use objective data, use consistent questioning, and follow the processes we've discussed today, you're going to reduce the chance of using bias, using inappropriate methods at recruitment. Use a variety of selection methods to show that this person with a tattoo is actually the very best candidate for the job. I've tested them at a work trial. I've got them to do a competency-based interview. We've done a follow-up phone interview. I've done 3 reference checks, and there is nothing telling me that they are anything but an outstanding employee, even though they have a tattoo. Sorry if anybody has tattoos. It's just an example I'm using. Rely on objective data, go back to data, go back to scoring, because the data doesn't lie. And do take the time to think about your selection decisions. Ask yourself, am I being biased in any way? Have I got a problem with young people? Have I got a problem with old people? Am I being too harsh because the person is female, male, etc.? Test yourself in your decision making, and then use multiple people to make those decisions. If we just go to the next slide, please. This slide is becoming more and more prevalent today. Neurodiversity covers a wide spectrum, and I've listed some of them of those neurological conditions, but it's not limited to those conditions. But the research says that 1 in 7 people within the workplace have some form of neurodiversity. And we automatically assume that people who have neurodiverse issues are worse off in terms of the job. But in actual fact, they can be much better at performing some jobs. So again, it goes back to a preconceived idea that if you have been assessed on a spectrum, you clearly aren't as good, but it's not the case. So again, you need to think about how you can adapt your process. If you just flip to the next slide, please. You need to think about your job descriptions being using inclusive language and showcasing that you are considering people with neurodiverse backgrounds. I'd be asking my colleagues about the job description content. Is it appropriate? Should I adapt some of the words? Perhaps make them more simple. We always want to make things look all jazzy and fully, grammatically, aesthetically pleasing, but go back to simple basic data and try and make sure that your job content is relevant for all people that are going to be reading it. Look at the fonts that you have on your job ad, on your website. Are they accessible to all people who might have difficulties in reading some of that content? Maybe think about your contact methods. Is it going to be email? Is it going to be phone? Can you use multiple methods? Can you diversify your selection methods so that if an interview face-to-face is too troubling for somebody, you might adapt that and do a work trial. You might have another method of using or assessing the same contents for people that have neurodiverse conditions. So there's all sorts of ways you can adapt, but be open and transparent about being the type of employer that will adapt to the process, and be flexible where you can, because it is becoming much more commonplace for businesses to need to have a whole diverse range of skill. And just because years gone by a job was performed in a certain way doesn't mean it is going to be the only way these days. We're becoming much more flexible with how we work, and I think it's really important that we do that. And if we just go to my next slide, please. We're almost there. If nothing else tells you to do it right, these are the reasons why. The Equality Act is the act that we are bound by legally. And as I said earlier, discrimination can be taken against any protected characteristic as part of the recruitment process. So it's really important that you are making sure your process is objective, is plausible, is recordable. I always encourage, in terms of data protection, that if you have a CV that's come through a job applicant process, you need to keep that CV, if you've considered it, for 6 months, plus 1 month for good measure, if you've rejected that CV, because a candidate can take you to the tribunal for unfair selection, post that job applicant or vacancy, I should say, being advertised. So you need to have your reasons why you've not selected somebody, not interviewed somebody. So you need to keep that data safe and be mindful that it is potentially could come under scrutiny under the discrimination for discrimination under the Equality Act. For employed people, you should be keeping the data for 6 years plus another. I always just add on another one just in case, for whatever reasons, people don't take any cases against you for a period of time. But legally, you have to keep data. You have to be able to justify, defend, and validate that data. So it's really important that your process is credible, your process is consistent, based on factual information, and does comply with GDPR. So do think about that when you are storing your data post recruitment, because it can get you into hot water if you're not doing it properly. Okay, and my final slide is one which is a bit lighter, but highly inclusive organizations generate 2.3 times more cash flow per employee, 1.4 times more revenue. They rate themselves 170% better at innovation, 180% better in their ability to adapt to change, and are 120% more capable of meeting financial targets. So try to go away from recruiting new and try to be more skillful at recruiting diversity in your organizations, because the diversity of your business will go to broader markets, wider customer markets, and you can really benefit from diversifying your recruitment. So I think it's a really valid point from Delnoir, and I think it's something that we should all be more mindful of as part of our recruitment process. Thank you for your patience. We've covered so much content. I appreciate there's a lot. I'd be happy to talk to anybody at a later date. But if you do have questions, I know some have come in, please do ask them now. Thank you.